Check one, check two. Welcome to Mindfulness Off the Cushion. If you're familiar with the challenges of living mindfully and are looking for help in your daily dance with suffering, our goal is to be a resource for you. So let's jump straight in to Mindfulness Off the Cushion, brought to you by the Austin Mindfulness Center. Welcome to Mindfulness Off the Cushion, episode 9. Today, we're going to unpack the idea of self-acceptance, which is in some ways related to last week's topic of self-compassion. Let's get started first, any one of you, by helping us define self-acceptance and then relating it to self-compassion. So we create somewhat of a bridge between this most recent episode and today's episode. If you can do it all in one breath, also explain the importance of it as it relates to mental health.
Self-acceptance, it's acknowledging the presence of the good in you as well, or the good or the wholesome, positive attributes in you, while also accepting and acknowledging the unwholesome traits in you. So it's really about accepting the whole range of what it means to be Claudio for me. And I recognize in my life, I have good, but I also have not so good. And how this relates to self-compassion is that when I become aware of my not so good attributes, I do not beat myself up over them. I recognize that they are there, present. I recognize that I can work with them and be with them in a way that is not going to provide further pain and suffering for myself. And I also reflect on the universality of these not so good attributes that I have, that every human, no matter if you live here in America, Nigeria, Spain, wherever, there is this quality that we have to being human.
I think that this process of self-acceptance and self-compassion are about the exploration of oneself in a curious, non-judgmental manner, which obviously when we use those words, non-judgmental, judgments may come up and some barriers, like we've discussed in past episodes, may come up to this exploration, but a little similar to Claudia, but a little different in that we're always whole. And that when we find things or feel things that make us, quote unquote, unwhole, the acceptance that we are actually still whole. And I remember my human behavior class at Fordham discussed the Greek concept of a holon, Holon, where it's kind of like the pieces make a whole and the whole have pieces. And I use this as a triangle of triangles for my folks that I work with, and as well as myself. There are some days or throughout this process where there'll be a piece of our triangle that feels bruised or feels not as strong as the other piece. That doesn't mean we're not a complete balanced triangle or a complete balanced person. I think self-acceptance is accepting that there'll be times when there are pieces of our triangle that feel, quote unquote, incomplete, but still loving ourselves through that. And kind of, I guess, in comparison to my car right now that's broken down, when you have a flat tire, does that mean your car is totaled? No, it means you just need to fix your tire. When you need to fix fluids in your car, does that mean your car is totaled? No, it means you need to fix fluids. So there's this idea sometimes when there's some sort of challenge or difficulty to make something ourself feel incomplete, that we're kind of catastrophically totaled. But I think the part of self-acceptance is accepting that we'll always have something to have to repair.
I like that. That implies that you're always in a state of growth and forward momentum. Like, we're not trying to establish a goal and reach the goal and be like, all right, smooth sailing from here. I am perfect. As I used to think I was in college, and then I realized like, oh no, I'm missing a lot of pieces of this puzzle. But I think that there's a lot of people that think that way. Like, let me get through these wounds. Let me make these repairs and then I'll be good. Rather than understanding that the world is a very dynamic place that's always changing. So we should also be changing with that. And macro level to micro level, the same thing. When I would do couples counseling, I'd have this conversation of people in long-term relationship. It's that, y'all aren't the same people you were when you started this relationship. So why does the relationship look the same? Why did the relationship not evolve with the people in it? Because you both grew on your own individual paths and as a unit, but the relationship, the dynamics, the interactions, the love languages, they all look the exact same as they did 10 years ago. And is that really the case? To me, self-acceptance, grabbing pieces from both of y'all's explanations, is just that recognition of, I have good parts of me that I can celebrate and that I can acknowledge, and it's really easy to take pride in. And then I have parts of me that aren't so great that I have to either learn to accept or practice that acceptance of, this is either temporary or I'm working on it, or it is what it is. There's no judgment to it. This is a limitation that I might have, or this is just how I respond to things, and that's okay. Growing up Catholic, we had this sense of, when you're doing good, that should be celebrated, but if there's anything negative going on, then you have to humble yourself to acknowledge it and then atone for it, as if this was some like flaw to your character. You made a mistake, so you have this stain of sin on you that you now have to atone to, which in the context of religion, okay, that makes sense. But in the context of how we operate as humans and just how we are as emotional creatures, that's a very dangerous way of thinking, that because I make a mistake, I now have this stain of negativity on me that I have to overcompensate for by acknowledging it, feeling bad for it, and then doing something to atone for it. And I think that's where a lot of this, colloquially, we'll call it the Catholic guilt or the Catholic shame. And growing up Mexican Catholic, it came from both ways, because we have that in Mexican culture as well. But it's the sense of, I did something wrong, so I am wrong, rather than I did something wrong and that's okay. Because behavior, for the most part, is very context dependent. So if you do something in one situation, it made sense for that situation, or at least that's how your body made sense of that situation, rather than, you were having a bad day, you got into an accident, you lost your job, you got broken up with, and then you just go off on somebody that, was short with you. And you could walk away with that, be like, man, I'm a horrible person. Or you can realize, this just wasn't my day. And that's the only way I could express myself in that moment. I was at the end of my rope. My tank was empty, and that is not how I usually respond to conflict. But if that's all you have in that moment, that's all you have in that moment, but that doesn't reflect your entire existence. So my question for y'all, I think it was Christina that said there's this sense of like self-acceptance and self-love, or loving that parts of yourself that you might not be happy with. Do y'all feel like that is a necessary component? Do you have to have this? Because I feel like that's really big these days, and you see it on social media all the time, of loving yourself and accepting yourself. Can you accept yourself without loving yourself, and vice versa? Is love that prerequisite for acceptance, or can you accept yourself and still not necessarily love yourself?
I think we'd have to break down the definition of love there, right? Because for me, the love is the discovery of this. So even if you don't absolutely love this thing that I hate about myself or dislike about myself, I'm still sending energy there. I'm still acknowledging, seeing, understanding that piece of me that I may not feel super excited about. And that way, that's where I'm defining love in this case, not this like, oh, I love you. Sometimes it's kind of like a tough love.
And for me, the love is, I guess I would say, intimately tied to the acceptance. That's when I hear that self-love, I do equate it to self-acceptance, in the sense that love is a pointer toward acceptance. That self-love creates the conditions for that self-acceptance to flourish more easily and readily. At the same time, I recognize that despite certain attributes of myself that I don't 100% agree with or wish that I could do better in, I do think that even I can love that part about myself that is not 100% wholesome.
I know generally this is like a tumultuous topic amongst later generations of, participation awards, right? There weren't participation awards in my day, I'm sure, as well as y'all's. But I think this falls into the participation award, if I will go along with that metaphor of making sure that you're showing up and making sure that you're looking at these things and parts of ourself because they're important, not just to us, but they're important to the world around us, which I'll probably now flow into my other versions of self that we've been alluding to in regards to the existential definition of what our self is, like, what are we here for? How does this thing that we may not like about ourselves, how is this affecting others? How does this affect the way we're thinking? How does it affect the way we're acting? How does it affect the way we're feeling and just being in the world? And then along lines of like the macro, meso, micro that we were chatting about before, the meso piece, then we kind of break it down to go a little more local in regards to our families and our communities. How is our self fitting in with our families? How do we feel in our community? There can be a lot of discrepancies around that could cause pieces of our triangle that feel bruised. If there are, unique parts of us, which I can say personally, unique parts of me that are different from my family, and having to work through those different parts, those unfamilial parts. I said unfamilial, but unfamiliar, but we can see how similar those words are. And then the last part, right? The self to ourself. What is it relative to? Is ourself, is it how people view ourselves versus how we view our own self? Because me talking about myself would be my ego, likely probably talking about myself. It'd be a little bit more of a process for me to talk more objectively of who I am as a person. And I think the pieces of who I think I am, who other people think I am, how other people experience me, how other people feel my energy when I'm around, I think is the definition or the complete self, like it or love it or hate it.
The concept of self is interesting because there's so much that feeds into it. There's psychology teaches us that we have a sense of self, and there's many schools of thought and theories that go around our self-concept and our self-identity and the sense of self. And then not all of that is even necessarily congruent with the mindfulness sense of self. But in psychology, the sense of self, there's a sense of self in the immediate, and then there's an ideal self, which is who we want to become under ideal circumstances. When I finish school, when I'm fully licensed, when I get to this point in my career, that is my ideal self, when I can balance everything and still survive. But then there's the sense of self that's now, and there's a lot that goes into that, which is our level of competency, our level of mastery, our social circles, things that we're influenced by, that we like, and whether we gear towards pessimism or optimism is all incorporated in our sense of self. And it's as if it's like a pie chart, and everyone's is different because for some people, who they socialize with is a much bigger piece of the pie than what they do for work. But for some people, what they do for work is like 98% of the pie, and then clothing and something else is over here. And depending on how much of that pie is created by things that are out of your control is definitely going to impact your sense of self. If you incorporate your political beliefs or religion or social justice movements into that, and that takes a turn for the worse, or something happens over there, or your person loses, or your sports team loses, then what does that do to your sense of self? And what does that do to your self-acceptance? Because that was just taken away from you. Versus when we're looking at the mindfulness sense of self, the things that you're in control of, that you can accept non-judgmentally, you're going to fare much better because your sense of self is going to be immovable by others. It doesn't matter what other people say or think about you, or your sports team or your politician or your religion is happening, because you are not aligned with that in terms of your self-concept. But I think it's a really good practice to take a step back and say, who am I actually? I remember when I was in counseling a few years ago, I have such varied interests. I enjoy being a chameleon that I can dress as a biker one day and then be in academic circles the next day in my sweet little tweed jacket because I want to live out this Indiana Jones fantasy. And then I can be wearing a Doctor Who shirt the day after that. And I've prided on myself being able to do this because I don't think that people should just have like one thing, like music is my thing, and that's all I do. I've enjoyed this eclectic life that I've built, but I was in therapy a few years ago, and I was struggling with this identity of like, who am I? Because I had one random Saturday where I had nothing, no commitments, no anything. And I was sitting there and standing in my closet thinking, what do I wear? Am I dressing like a biker today? Am I dressing in my button down today? Am I wearing a normal t-shirt? And it was just this weird existential crisis to have at like 26. And I remember like processing that of who am I under all this stuff? And then I realized I was putting too much of myself in that this is a piece of me. This is a piece of me, rather than this is me. And this is where I choose to spend my energy this day. And this is where I choose to spend my energy this day.
And my question to you, Patrick, and my question to you, Christina, is how much of the suffering or the stress that you come across from your clients comes from that over-identification with sense of self on something external, meaning that their sense of self is tied to that which is, in the words of Patrick, constantly changing. Your likes, dislikes, your clubs, your organizations, your relationships, your clothes, right? So how much of our suffering or stress comes from that over-identification with external factors of things?
Well, I think that that's when I think the surrendering of the ego comes in for me personally, because I think what Patrick is explaining, and I experienced this as well in my sort of journey of self-discovery that continues and continues, is, as you're saying, the real versus ideal self in psychology. We're talking about the totality of the person. Sometimes our pie charts, as he was saying, or our triangles are sort of figured out or told for us as far as how we're going to live our life and how we're going to be valued. I think we sometimes viscerally or psychologically feel it when, well, if for me, I guess, I'll bring up a radical kind of example, but a real one. If there is a gender bias in corporations or workplaces, me going into the work environment and expecting 50%, say, of my value to be valued, not with our company, Lance, but maybe others in the past. And it doesn't feel 50%. And I've worked the same as someone else who's receiving that 50%, say this person is a male, say it's not, but let's just in this case, then I think it's my duty as a human to figure out other pieces of my pie that I need to work on. And that's where I get more existential, because some things don't fit literally or, or figuratively. So it's kind of like, what are the attributes we're making that we are buying into these things of our pie that make us complete? And when can we be flexible enough to shift what our identity actually is, or what our self actually means, so we can feel happy and balanced in the world and feel okay? And this does matter in the world, right? Because it does matter about how ourselves fit into this, 3D, 4D world dimension that we live in. Even when I'm on airplanes, for example, I can tell the difference between if I'm wearing something more professional versus wearing something that's just me. Same person, but I do end up, getting treated differently. And I know a lot of other people get treated the same way. So I think there are a lot of pieces that poke at our sense of self. And that's another challenge that I think self-compassion can really end up illuminating for us, or highlighting where some work needs to be done.
It slips into that space of cognitive dissonance when this is my understanding of self. This is how this thing should go, this external force or belief or whatever. And then it doesn't pan out how we think it should pan out. Our brains don't like that disconnection, that anxiety of, I believe 100% this way, but then this thing happens. So our brain kind of fills the gaps, whether consciously or unconsciously. And then that's when attribution error slips in, where I'll use this as an example because I don't necessarily care about sports, but I'm from Houston. Astros lost last night, and you could say that like Astros are the best team in the MLB, and that like they're gonna win the World Series?
World Series.
Is that baseball? World Series. And that is my self-concept, is like Astros are the best team, and then they lose, and then that's when I can't recognize that they're not the best team, but it was just demonstrated like quantitatively that okay, they lost by points and by game, so they are on paper not the best team. But that makes me uncomfortable. So, somebody must have cheated, or the refs were on their side, or, they were playing in a very brave, fan-heavy area. So that impacted the game, rather than just saying like, this wasn't our year. It was, here's all of these external things that I'm going to place the blame on, rather than having to recognize that this is a hit to my ego and this just wasn't the case. And I think that happens all across the board. And it reminds me, I think our last recording, Claudio, is when you dropped that bomb of pain times resistance equals suffering. And I think that's it, is instead of just accepting that, okay, this just wasn't the Astros year. Let me hold on to that and say, no, they're going to come back, or no, they cheated, or no, they're going to review the footage and find out that they did actually win. You're just a product of your own suffering at that point, rather than, well, that happened and that's okay.
This podcast is sponsored by the Austin Mindfulness Center, the premier mental health counseling center in Texas for mindfulness-based therapy, education, and coaching. If you're an individual or couple struggling with stress, anxiety, depression, relationship issues, or you're just looking to better equip yourself to gracefully navigate these turbulent times, you can visit us online at austinmindfulness.org and request an appointment today. Now let's get back to our podcast.
And what I love about the practice is that the practice always points us to accept things as they are. This practice of mindfulness is reality based in that sense, that no matter what we're experiencing, if we can move the heart and the mind and the body toward accepting things as they are, then it is easier for us to either let go of the need for this particular thing to be the way that I want it to be, and also to let go of any of the stress and suffering that comes because I've attached to it. And this letting go I think it's a very important step in us recognizing this notion of self, and also us recognizing this notion of acceptance and compassion toward ourselves. My notion of letting go is not to let go into the nothingness, into the black hole of nothingness. When I say let go, that is coupled always with a letting go into. We let go of our want for the Astros to win, right? And we let go into a notion of acceptance. So when we let go, we abandon something in order to gain something. And usually, most of the time through this mindfulness framework, that which we gain is greater than that which we let go of. This is part of this practice and why I cherish it so.
I think there's a distinct difference too, as we're chatting about all these topics, is coming to me in regards to abandonment, which is one of my favorite topics as well clinically. And I guess I'm considered a quote unquote expert in, but Susan Anderson talks about the swirl of abandonment, and the first letter of S means shattering. And it does feel as if we experienced a moment where we felt shattered. And that could be a moment of realization that we are different from someone. That could be a moment where we perceive some sort of piece of failure. It can be a shattering of hopes and dreams of we expected to win the World Series or Super Bowl or whatever. Letting go and surrendering of the ego, I think that can be a very difficult topic, thinking of how I experienced it when I first started doing this work. And it feels painful, right? To kind of let go of that attachment to self. And I think what you're alluding to, and the way I describe it, is when you're letting go, you feel like you're losing a piece of yourself when you're actually allowing the other pieces of ourself in. In order for us to love ourselves, we need to know ourselves and love every part of ourselves. In that way, I feel like that examination and that self-acceptance is almost like a prerequisite to then also be compassionate with the things that we are accepting about ourselves, like it or not. Right? We know that control is an illusion. And so to think that we can control some parts of ourselves, things that we cannot actually control, is a funny thing that our brain or our ego likes to tell us that we can control.
Well, my question would be, when you let go of control, for all you type A personalities out there, when you let go of control, contemplate or reflect on what you will let go into, or what you abandon and what you gain when you let go of control. I did this little exercise with the 9 essential attitudes, and I paired them with their opposite. So for example, if you're a perfectionist and you let go of the need for perfection, then you gain non-judging, which is one of the essential attitudes of mindfulness. When you let go of control, you gain patience, which is another essential attitude. So it was interesting exercise to see how the 9 essential attitudes pair up with their opposite, and what happens when you let go of those unwholesome attributes of mind and what you let go into.
No, and it's interesting too. Again, the idea of perfectionism also comes from the ego, right? Because we're already admitting when we are saying we're trying to act, it's almost self-injurious behavior if we're constantly acting in a place of perfectionism, because we're already admitting to ourselves that we are not already perfect the way we are, whether we make a mistake or not, right? That idea of perfectionism is never ending. You'll never reach that goal.
Let me ask this question, and Patrick's going to, in his mind, he's going to think, oh, here goes Lance. He's going to split hairs again. And I know it's not this elementary, but I do know, we all have a limited amount of time. And so if I recognize that I might need help with self-compassion, or I might need help with self-acceptance, or perhaps both, I'd like to recommend a starting point. So my second grader or third grader level question is, does self-acceptance lead into self-compassion, or does self-compassion lead into self-acceptance? Let's see if we can bolt down the relationship between the two and perhaps suggest a starting point for someone who might be struggling.
In order to know oneself, we need to know our parts and know all the parts, and we need to accept those parts, so self-acceptance, and then to have self-compassion once we figure those parts out and loving all those parts. And then there's the other definition of self-compassion, where it's just compassionate, even figuring out those parts. So I think a practical approach, from my opinion, and what I share with my individuals I work with, is having a sort of, again, like sort of like a schedule or some time, carved out for oneself to figure out what they want to do within that time. We talked about it in the times past. Sometimes it's a working time for ourselves. Sometimes it's a resting part for ourselves. And either way, it's kind of listening and challenging what our bodies or minds are telling us we ought to be doing or should be doing.
That's an interesting question. Kind of like that CBT model of, our cognitions affect our behaviors, and our behaviors affect our emotions. And, where do you start? It's the chicken or the egg? Am I sad because I'm thinking sad thoughts, or vice versa? The thought of a starting point between self-compassion and self-acceptance, it oversimplifies the idea of mindfulness, that mindfulness is this holistic approach to being and life, that it's not, to break it down to which comes first makes it sound like a checklist of, to be practicing mindfulness, you have to do X, Y, and Z, or you have to start with A, which will then lead you to B, then will unlock C. That's not necessarily the best way to approach mindfulness. I don't know. I always take it back to intention. Like, I feel like intention is the starting point for like most things of what is the intention? Like, are you trying to improve your relationship with yourself or overall compassion? And are you just practicing introspection? Are you only practicing acceptance and compassion inward, or are you also practicing it outward? Because then you're going to have this kind of conflict with, okay, let me practice self-acceptance and self-compassion, but still kind of be a douche to everybody around me. That's going to be incompatible and kind of derail your progress as well. I don't know. That's a good one to kind of reflect on.
It's not linear. It's not A to B to C to D.
Yeah.
I do agree with that. It is transrelational. It is systemic. Yeah. It's like the 9 essential attitudes, right? Well, which one's the first?
Well, I don't know. What if acceptance were the first one? What if? Okay.
But I'm saying, how can you practice acceptance if you don't practice letting go? I think that it's meant to function as a system, as a network, right, as a framework.
So Tara Brach, in her book, suggested that self-acceptance is the willingness to accept one's self, one's life, exactly as it is, which creates the possibility of change. And in that, I am extrapolating that without that acceptance, there is no possibility of change.
Sure. And then the question becomes, what are we accepting? I'm saying, how can we, in the moment that we're experiencing an afflictive emotion, let's say blame, self-blame, something which I imagine a lot of people out there experience, self-blame. So in that moment that you're experiencing self-blame, to offer the advice to somebody, just accept self-blame, just accept yourself. That's hard. That's hard for somebody to do in the moment. I would offer, then this is the mindfulness framework that I like to use, which is, first, can we pause? So I'm offering now some like A to Z nuts and bolts instructions on how to let go of self-blame in the moment. The first step would be to pause. In that moment that we are experiencing self-blame, can we pause, slow down, soften, drop in, notice what's obvious? In this moment, self-blame is obvious. Acknowledge it as such. Put a label on it. Note it. Self-blame. With that noting and that labeling, you move into this realm of acceptance. You're creating the conditions for acceptance. Once you have that, you turn toward this experience of self-blame? Can you notice the aversion that you're experiencing with this experience of self-blame? Can you turn toward it with curiosity and kindness and allow it to be present in your mind body system. Because guess what? It is present. That's that reality based attribute of mindfulness. Once you've turned toward it, can you investigate it now? And this is where you need that mental civilization, that ability to concentrate and to focus. Can you move with an open, non-judgmental mind and investigate this quality of self-blame? How does it feel in the body? Where does it manifest in the body? What else is happening in the mind body as you're experiencing the self-blame? What is being believed in this moment? And then finally, once you've investigated it, can you notice a change? Notice the impermanent nature of this self-blame. Because no matter how much self-blame you have, it will not last forever. It doesn't last forever. Those little steps, nuts and bolts of how you can work with this experience of self-blame in the moment. That's just one way. That's a more receptive way of working with self-blame in the moment.
But that's always talking about the intention behind it, because if the intention is just to change and move forward, you can do that in a negative way too. But if your intention is to practice more mindful living and incorporate mindfulness to accomplish these goals, then that's another thing. It's like the difference between a positive coping skill and a negative coping skill. I can cope with anxiety negatively. I can drink because, you know what, I feel really good after a paloma versus let me take the time to meditate or go exercise. But it's kind of like being in a boat with two holes and one plug. You just move the plug from one hole to the other and you've created a new problem. It's still a coping skill because it's accomplishing what it's intending to accomplish, but it's a negative coping skill because it's creating another problem down the road. So if to say that you can only change through self-compassion and self-acceptance, that's not necessarily true, because you can change through guilt, you can change through shame, you can change through comparisons and all of that, but you're not going to be doing this mindfully, and you're not going to be doing it the most healthy or efficient or effective way. I remember when I had some like workout goals, there was this, I think they were a writer for Conan. I think they're on SNL now, but they have this funny little like 7-minute video. And I think was supposed to be inspirational, but was more like very anti-mindfulness and very negative. But it was this guy that was like working at this mattress place and his girlfriend breaks up with him. And he realizes like, oh, I need to get in shape and I need to meet new people. So he starts going to the gym and he's very, it's called like how to lose weight in 6 easy steps or something like that. And it's like step 1, do this, step 2. And then there's this sense of like self-deprecation was a necessary step to motivate yourself to push yourself harder. And I bought into that. I used to watch this before going to the gym. And there's this funny, it's meant to be funny, but in the video, he's standing in front of the mirror, soaking wet with sweat. And he's like, you piece of crap, you piece of crap. And then he works harder the next day. And I used to do that. I embody that. Like I have to hate parts of myself to change them. And it worked. I hit my fitness goals. I looked how I wanted it, but along the way, I didn't practice mindfulness and celebrate victories and celebrate milestones and then celebrate the accomplishment, because it didn't feel like I gained something. It felt like I just got rid of things that I hated. Yeah, I mean, you can still change in a negative way without compassion and acceptance. But again, it goes back to the intention of, I want to do this mindfully. Then yes, you need this to lay the foundation.
I was going to bring this back, actually, if I can, for 1 second, about something practical that may help some of our listeners that I experience often and with a lot of our clients in regards to ourself and our control. And it's the idea of whether or not to go on some sort of psychotropic medication and how that affects people's view of self and pieces of that feel like they are giving up, quote unquote, control of themselves when they're processing trauma. And obviously I'm speaking about this objectively. I support people either way, whether they decide to go down this journey or not, but just in relation to the self, it gets brought up a bunch in a very practical sense of, well, if I go on psychiatric medication of some sort, am I still myself? Do I become more of myself, become less of myself? Am I surrendering control, quote unquote? A lot of side effects also, right? And when we talk about side effects of medications, like, that also can affect, quote unquote, what we can control. And when I say control in big air quotes, it's just our ego. And so I say to them, if we can control whether or not we take the medication, who's in control? If we're able to control how we think about something, then who is in control? And so I think part of it is going to those deep, dark places that we think will change ourselves or will make us sort of like less of a person, or like you were saying, Patrick, things that we hate about ourselves. Going to those parts, if you're able to hate that part of you, then you're still in control because it's something that you are giving energy to.
I just want to add one thing really quickly. And
Okay.
Patrick is pointing to this notion of intention and whether we can change with when I say a more wholesome intention versus a more unwholesome intention. So this process of that I went over, that is a process in wanting to practice self-compassion and self-awareness through a more wholesome intention. And what I mean by wholesome, I simply mean that which brings no harm to yourself or another human being.
Is there a direct correlation, Christina? I think you mentioned this idea of wholeness, right? Is there a direct correlation between this idea of wholeness and wholesome?
I mean, I'm sure there is, and I'm sure there isn't.
Probably. I'm sure there is.
A Venn diagram belly in the middle. Wholeness versus feeling whole.
It's okay. It may not be important.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess if you were to like look at something literally versus figuratively, like looking at going back to the car, we're using an object, but say as a person, we don't like something about ourselves. And it's like me having a flat tire. Is the car unwhole because there's a piece of it that's not working? Is there a piece of me that feels unwhole that because part of me I feel like is quote unquote not working? I can still feel wholesome, and I can still feel, and I think that's the difference, the shift of the mindset between being mindful about when you're working on something versus maybe a non as mindful approach when the ego kind of innervates and says, you're junk. You have a flat tire. That means you just don't work. Right. You're broken.
Well, you mentioned that like the psychedelics that are coming up, and that's my dissertation's on ketamine. And I've learned a lot on the sense of like what makes them important. Because when people hear like, ooh, you can go do some shrooms and feel better about your depression. It's like, I mean, if you want to reduce it down to that, but really what we're doing is you're processing an egoless state, is you're just removing that should'ves and would'ves. And this is what I'm supposed to be. You take all of that away and you can just process things in its purest form. That's super cool. And it's unfortunate that it comes with the use of psychedelics, because I feel like that's a significant barrier to that field in mental health. Is there's going to be the people that are like, ooh, drugs are bad, or this is, legal barriers to conducting the research. But the fact that we have something that can suspend ego, that can suspend judgment and really put yourself in a place of self-acceptance is fantastic. And to be able to take that with you. So it's not just when you're actively in the experience of psilocybin or ayahuasca or ketamine. It's that you can take that with, as long as you weren't overdosed and completely detached and you still have that memory, you can take all of the benefits of processing an egoless state with you.
Yeah. And to add to that too, right? You're speaking about the functions of the amygdala, but you have to mention the functions of the hippocampus, right? About our memories and what kind of keeps us neurophysiologically from going places of memories of once I went here before, it didn't work for me. Or once I went here before, it initiates my state of fear, and therefore I don't want to go here again. And I think part of that self-compassion and self-acceptance is one, accepting that there are things that kind of freeze us up or make us feel like we are quote unquote out of control or just feeling uncomfortable. And then there are the other parts that we just need to love that part too. So right, the hippocampus, the amygdala, and more about the ketamine examples of this, but just in general trauma work and work of self, having all parts of our brains and all of our experiences and memories and what it likes to do and the stories it likes to tell about whether we are good or not good, or even the black and white thinking, I think has a lot to do with the self-discovery process.
And ultimately, Christina, we are all worthy enough to accept ourselves, correct?
100%, 200%, completely. Whether we have a couple pieces of our triangle that are unbalanced, and this is what I always say, and metaphorically, the bottom right piece of our triangle is quote unquote damaged or broken or bruised. There are other strong parts of our triangle that are still holding us up, that are still making us show up, that are still understanding certain things. So it's accepting that quote unquote injury, but also accepting the need to want to heal that, while also thinking if I'm walking with a limp, that doesn't mean that I'm completely broken. I'm still whole, and the other pieces of my triangle are holding me up.
self-acceptance is the practice of accepting oneself. I like this definition better, though. Self-acceptance is the practice of complete acceptance of one's complete self. True self-acceptance is embracing who we are unconditionally without exceptions. It's important to remember that even when we fail or fall short, we are still whole and worthy and perfect just as we are. And what's cool about that is this in turn allows our happiness to be unconditional as well. It opens the door for our happiness to exist regardless of what others think about us or what we think others might be thinking about us. Instead, our joy is based on who we are. When I've been able to actually wrap my head around this idea and truly embody it, even if only for a moment, it's so incredibly freeing. I can literally feel a sense of calm and warmth wash over me when I do this. I encourage you to give it a try. Coming into this episode, I didn't realize the strong relationship between acceptance and letting go, but it makes perfect sense to me now. If we can let go of our expectations of the way things or the way we should be, we are also letting go of the stress that comes from being so attached to those expectations. And then we have the ability to more easily accept ourselves and our lives as they are. Today we talked a bit about ego as well, how perfectionism comes from the ego and how our ego might be at the very root of our difficulties and struggles. We're going to go down that rabbit hole next week, and I can't wait to see what we discover.